So good morning, good morning, good morning. It's an absolutely glorious day out here. We're in this field where there are actually cows at the far end of the field. So it's just I have to kind of get my dogs through here, persuading them that there's nothing worth rolling in. I'm just going over to see what it is that Banjo has decided. Let me just turn the camera around because you can see them with great. Oh, here they go. They found something. Sorry, that's not something you want to see this morning. They'll be under the hose pipe when we get home. So what are we doing this morning? In my kind of super spiritual state that I have, I have to confess I've not exactly been led by the Holy Spirit so much as led by my phone app. So there have been several occasions in the last couple of weeks where I've just kind of got into the habit of opening my Bible app on my phone and seeing what verse it gives me and going and thinking about the passage. And I don't think I've actually tended to use the verse it throws up. It's much more that it's given me a bit of a kind of direction and context. But I'm sure the Spirit can be in the app as well, so that's good. Anyway, this morning it gave me a verse from 1 John, and the passage it landed in touched on something actually which I was dealing with the other day. I can't remember what day it was, but the issue of the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. The two aren't in conflict, but they give us a different perspectives. There's no doubt, if you like, that the Gospels unpack for us the Christ of history, and then Paul in his letters unfolds the Christ of faith. But by his own confession, if you go to the end of the book of Acts where he's telling his story for the third time, he talks about that Jesus commissions him to be a witness to the things he is going to show him. And so Paul writes, if you like, out of a sense of revelation that has been given to him by the ascended Christ of what it now means for Christ to be expressed much more clearly in his divinity, whereas the Gospels give us that sense of Jesus in his humanity, and those two things kind of hold together. So the verse that it threw up for me this morning from John's letters, 1 John chapter 4. It starts with the passage we often remember, because we often take them in little groups of verses and we don't do the whole bigger context. So we've often heard it talks about testing every spirit. Does it come from God or is it not? Is it the spirit of the Antichrist? And right at the heart of that discussion, the first thing is to say we're not talking about, if you like, a pantheon of spirits in this context. If you read the passage, it's not talking about evil spirits, even though it talks about the spirit of the Antichrist. It's actually talking about the inclination of the human spirit involved. That's a kind of a common thing that you kind of pick up. It's a bit like in Romans 8, which Watchman Nee makes a reference to being no two translations capitalise the word spirit in the same way, because it's never quite sure is it talking about the human spirit or the Holy Spirit. But in a similar way here, we're missing the fact it's about the human spirit most of the time in this passage, but we often think of it as kind of floating demonic spirits. But that doesn't make sense, because the idea of a demonic spirit being a kind of good spirit that we should connect into just doesn't work. And we mustn't forget, if you like, that we have our own part to play in the mix. I suspect that while there are real personalised demonic spirits, very often when we're talking about spiritual kind of deliverance for folks, it is actually more about cleaning up the human spirit. It's somehow got infected through the things that have been done to it, the wounds inflicted on it, and the way it reacts, and so on. But anyway, that's another thing. It's not what I'm driving at, because it makes this thing that in 1 John about those who deny that Christ has come in the flesh. So it's an unusual thing to say, because I take a view that all of the New Testament is written before the destruction of the temple, and I stand by that as I'm saying this now. The way I would put it is that there's no internal evidence that requires you to put any of the books of the New Testament into the post the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's actually a very strong argument. It's often glossed over as if it's somehow trivial, but actually the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, was a major, major event that theologically fits the agenda of the early church so perfectly that you have a real hard job explaining why, if you take the view that the Gospels are written after 70 and 1 John is a book that historically people think is written about 95 AD, but I would put in the late 60s, because you have to explain why it is that they don't actually make their argument really forceful by pointing out what's happened to Jerusalem. So often the destruction of the Jerusalem would be the crowning kind of glory of an argument that doesn't seem to know anything about it. But why am I saying that? Well, the reason I'm saying that is because it's one of the, if you like, the positive arguments. I don't necessarily therefore agree with it, but it's a positive argument as to why 1 John is thought to have been 1 John is thought to have been written a bit later, is because it's saying, oh well, it's dealing with Docetism in the church, and that kind of emerges much more at the end of the first century. But I suspect that the same ideas were embryonically there, right from the early days of the church, but more so as the church moved away from Jerusalem. So by the 60s, by the late 60s, in fact, most of the church, according to Hegesippus, or Hegesippus, I think it is, isn't it? They've left Jerusalem in the late 60s, because of Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the city and the warning that when you see these things beginning to happen, you should get out. And so we're told that the early church, led by Simon, who is the son of Cleopas, who's one of the two disciples, therefore Simon and Cleopas, who are on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus appears to them in a resurrection. He's now the leader of the church after James, and under him, the early church vacates the city. So they've left. So, of course, as you get further away from Jerusalem, and as less and less of the church are staying full-time, living full-time in Jerusalem, they're taking the advice of Jesus more seriously. It's easier and easier as you move into the Gentile world for the concept of Jesus to kind of focus, if you like, on the Pauline revelation of what Jesus means from his ascended position. So you can start to see a thing where, well, the historical details aren't so important as the, if you like, the mystical details. And so the mystical becomes detached from the historic, which is why I said it touched on something I was touching on, I can't remember how many days ago. The difference, because there is a difference in flavour, but they're rooted in the same person. And they're rooted in a real person with a real historical concept. But what we see through the writings of Paul, which is then actually using the Old Testament as a reflection. So he looks back on Jesus, reflected through the Old Testament, the implications of the life, the human life he sees with very normal history, normal upbringings, all of those sorts of things. He sees, if you like, the Christological, the cosmic implications of Jesus' divinity. Jesus' humanity matters in certain contexts, Jesus' divinity matters in others, and the two kind of blend together, and something unique is created in that kind of creative moment. Anyway, these are 10 minutes in the morning of theological waxing, which you don't often get very often, do you? We often make it very practical, applicable when we kind of do Sunday morning church and so on. And I totally get that. We want to make, how do I deal with this disruptive or dishonest person at work? How do I treat them with love? All of those kind of things. They're very practical. But as a result, sometimes we get squeezed out that kind of more theological element or time and opportunity. So maybe these 10 minutes are just a way of fusing that. So 1 John, it's chapter 4, to test the spirits. That's right, go back there, testing the spirits. So, and every spirit that confesses that Christ is Lord, which doesn't mean a one-off, it just means something that in my spiritual life, if I find my spirit is constantly seeing Jesus as Lord, then that's a good spirit. There's something in me that it's the Holy Spirit is clearly affecting and cleaning up rather than it going rotten the other way. On that whole thing, remember it says in 1 Corinthians, the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet, which I think is really interesting. If we're going to, because the prophet is looking to deliver something for the edification of the wider church out of their own spiritual life, and so it's really important that actually they take responsibility for making sure their spirit is getting cleaned up properly. Yeah, anyway, that's another morning, isn't it? But just getting that idea of our spirit, we want to make sure, keep it clean, and we kind of know that it's getting cleaner because we find that we're seeing Jesus in more places, we're honouring him more ways, he really is becoming Lord. But the contrast he makes, which is interesting, because I think that you see in the church the two extremes. On the one extreme, you've got this tendency. I'm going to start cutting into the long grass, actually, because we've got some horses coming across the field. And my dogs are very good with them, but it just means I have to kind of take a little bit more control. Banjo! Come on! So we're going to cut through the to the middle. So I'm going to show you just quite how high the grass is now. Yeah, there we go. Luna, you stay with us. Come on. What were we saying? Oh yeah. I totally forgotten where I was. Okay, let's go to where I was intending to go. Because as you move on down that passage about testing the spirits and so on, and the good spirits, or the spirit of the Antichrist, that's it, the spirit of the Antichrist. And the spirit of the Antichrist, actually when you look at it, has become, oh that's right, I was talking about how the church splits into two ways. So in the liberal church, which is often very powerless, often has some beautiful ideas in it, has a lot of, it's looking for the aesthetic, if you like, but often totally lacks power. And it gets very focused, if you like, on the humanity of Jesus, and in the end it kind of sees Jesus just purely in the flesh, doesn't see his divinity at all. And then on the flip side you get a kind of an extreme in some forms of Pentecostalism, which actually verges on what John is addressing here. So I raise it because it's a temptation for all of us. We can flip either of those two ways very easily, and we're conning ourselves if we think we don't. And so, because it goes on and says, he then kind of goes on to that thing of how God is love. And if you have love, you have God, and so on. And the funny thing is, what you sometimes find is that side of it, which John is about to go on to as he unpacks, which is, if you like, the part of the Christological nature. Sorry, it's part of the cosmic Christ side of things. It's God is love, and those who love know God, and etc. etc. It's very easy to then get kind of totally divorced from the teachings of the historical Jesus. And so you will find in certain kind of threads, and you will all encounter it with lovely people, because we're all trying to find our way with the Lord and working out our way, and we kind of swing one way and then another. So it's not something that is just for them out there, but you'll encounter those kind of arguments like, oh well, Jesus taught this, but it doesn't really count for us as Christians because he was teaching before the cross, and now everything now is post the cross. But then you think, well, what's the point of the historic Jesus? If it's just the cross, we might as well know nothing about him, if I can put it that way. We have to understand something, and it sometimes takes a little bit more effort to understand the two together and how the two are held in tension, but it's so much more worth it. And sorry, I'm going to finish because I'm taking quite a lot of time, aren't I, this morning with these thoughts. But the flip side of what I'm driving at is it's a kind of everything is, oh, God is so loved, so God is so loved that there's this and there's that and there's this and there's that. But as you kind of read on, in John 4, he highlights the role of Christ crucified, of Jesus who actually physically dies. And I just mention it because from people I very much respect, I've seen a kind of little meme kind of bouncing around the place, kind of, and where it says, well, that verse, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. That doesn't count for us, because Paul says in the law, and they're right at one level, absolutely they're correct in that. But where they miss it then is that very often it then becomes therefore that forgiveness is trivial, if I can put it that way. Forgiveness is trivial, and actually somehow God is so big and so enormous that he doesn't really have to bother, and our sin doesn't matter, and our forgiveness is just an easy thing. And I don't think that is the biblical revelation. The biblical revelation, so that it is absolutely true, under the law there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. But actually, in truth, forget the law, there is no forgiveness without something in someone having to die. A right has to die. C.S. Lewis makes this kind of comment. He points out that if forgiveness is easy, then you haven't got anything to forgive. But when forgiveness is hard, something in you has to disappear. Your right to something and the history and integrity of who you were to that moment has to somehow give way for the sake of the relationship that you're looking to preserve via your forgiveness. And so there is if you like, the limit on where we should go with that. That actually, there is no forgiveness of sins except with the shedding of blood. Doesn't count for us because actually, in the Old Testament, I don't really desire sacrifice. I want mercy, etc., etc. Because in the end, something does die. Something in God has to go. Something, if you like, of His wonderful, perfect nature, and pureness and purity. And actually, in the cross and in the life of Jesus' suffering, therefore, is tied to that. It's not just something that happened because we're bad, but God's forgiven us and He didn't have to go through it. He really does have to go through something. And that's at the heart of this kind of idea of the denial of that is to actually try and say, so who we are doesn't really matter. It's all kind of, God is so big and different and distinct from us. And while we don't always see the implications, sorry, I've just had a bug fly into my eye. While we don't always see the direct implications of it, it kind of sets us down a path, and John is quite clear on it. It becomes a kind of an antichrist path, because in the end it's kind of, it makes God far more, so unknowable to us.